Hello, it's Georgia Raisman. I'm on Front Up this morning with Bill Cohan, a fellow Sconseter, writer, former Wall Street person, and recently a writer of a number of books about Wall Street and its inhabitants and its denizens, perhaps we should say. But the most recent book, or the one that interested me most and maybe of most interest to our viewers, is called Why Wall Street Matters. So I thought we would talk today because Bill is an advocate for Wall Street, about why Wall Street matters, because we're in an era where a lot of public figures, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren among them, think that Wall Street only matters in a negative way, and the thing to do about it is to limit it, get rid of it, make it much less important in our national life. So if you don't mind telling us, Bill, how did you come to this position? How did you start out? You started out as a journalist, am I right?
I did start as a journalist. I'm a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, and then was a journalist, and then went to Columbia Business School later, and then went to Wall Street for 17 years, and then in 2004 went back to writing. So I've been writing now about 14 years, 5 books, 4 about Wall Street, 1 about the Duke lacrosse scandal. I have another book coming out next July about friends of mine from high school and what happened to them. I was actually in the middle of writing the book that's coming out next July when Elizabeth Warren, speaking of Elizabeth Warren, decided that somebody I had worked with on Wall Street, I'd worked at Lazard for a number of years, and a guy I had trained at Lazard, Antonio Weiss, who ended up becoming the head of investment banking at Lazard, had been nominated by President Obama to be an undersecretary of the Treasury. He was willing to sort of give up his very high-paying job at Lazard. He had, exquisite progressive credentials. He wasn't just floated as a name by President Obama. He was nominated. That means he was vetted. That means he was underwritten. That means he was investigated. That means that, his dossier was made, and he came through all of that. And President Obama nominated him for this job, and he was willing to give up his very large salary to go work in the final 2 years of the Obama administration. And at that point, Elizabeth Warren was probably at the height of her recent powers on the Senate Banking Committee, and she refused to even meet with Antonio because he happened to have the audacity to work on Wall Street. So here is a guy with perfect progressive credentials, willing to share what he knows about Wall Street and the way the system works and how it needs to be corrected. And I'm, by the way, you said I'm an advocate for Wall Street. I'm an advocate for Wall Street working properly, for doing the right thing by the American people, and what it does right should be celebrated, and there's a lot to celebrate, and what it does wrong needs to be fixed. Right. So I've been an advocate for a long time for fixing Wall Street too. Right. But so when Elizabeth Warren wouldn't even meet with Antonio Weiss, I thought that was appalling. Right. Right. She's a public servant. Right. He's trying to also be a public servant, nominated by a very popular president of her own party. Right. So the fact that she wouldn't even meet with him basically killed his nomination. He had to withdraw.
Who do you want to run Treasury? Somebody who's totally uninformed about how Wall Street operates?
Exactly. It's ridiculous. She later has informed me that she had voted for Jack Lew, who was the Treasury Secretary at that time, who had briefly worked at Citigroup, as an example of how she didn't always denigrate everybody who worked on Wall Street. But honestly, she is known for denigrating Wall Street. She's made her political bones denigrating Wall Street. By the way, I'm, a liberal guy from Massachusetts. I should be a huge Elizabeth Warren fan. And mostly I am, but on the subject of Wall Street, she's become a demagogue. And so as a result of that whole incident involving Antonio Weiss, I decided we really needed to step back and examine what it is that Wall Street does right and we should remember and celebrate, and what it does wrong that we should try to fix. Mm-hmm. So I decided to stop the book I was writing, and while I was here 2 summers ago, write Why Wall Street Matters.
Mm-hmm. And well, that you start out with a kind of a history of the fact that panics and problems that occur that cause a lot of economic damage precede Wall Street, and so the blaming issues like economic damage that we've all suffered from on Wall Street alone is wrong, and obviously that people sometimes tend to forget that. But tell us, basically, go back to why Wall Street matters in an economic sense to everyday people. I mean, what does Wall Street do for
well, look, I mean,
us?
there are so many things that it does that we just completely take for granted.
I think people forget that, and they demonize Wall Street. First off, you probably define it. So let us know whether we're talking about very big banks, whether we're talking about the guy on the Cape Cod Five, or who are we talking about?
Well, first of all, there aren't any Wall Street firms on Wall Street anymore. That's sort of ironic. Wall Street itself, there's the U.S. Branch of Deutsche Bank, which is in the old J.P. Morgan building at 60 Wall Street, where I once worked for J.P. Morgan. Wall Street itself has become sort of like a Disney set, a Potemkin village of what used to be a thriving financial center. Now Wall Street is sort of an idea. There are a lot of the big banks have now moved to Midtown. Goldman Sachs is still downtown on the Hudson River. So what I'm referring to is sort of Wall Street writ large. It's our financial system, which is of course driven by the big Wall Street banks. But in many ways, there's no difference between Cape Cod 5-cent savings bank and the big Wall Street banks. They all are engaged in the business of taking our raw material, which is money, which we give them through our savings accounts and our checking accounts, and J.P. Morgan Chase, which is our biggest bank, has something like $1.5 trillion of deposits that we give them for basically free. If you look at your checking account and your savings account, the interest that you get from them, what they pay you for that is about as close to zero as you could possibly get.
Right.
So they take that raw material and then they lend it out to corporations, schools, municipalities, big businesses, small businesses, and they take the spread, and that spread is essentially the difference between what they pay for that money, which is close to zero, and what they get in return, which can often be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%, depending, and plus all the fees. That is essentially what banking is all about. But I think what Wall Street does that people forget is that they provide capital to small and big businesses around the globe, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that enables companies all around the world to, create iPhones that we take for granted, to have our Stop and Shop shelves stocked to the rafters with food, allows us to drive our pickup trucks around all the rotaries around here. It allows for a thriving economy and people who have the goods and services they need for an affordable price. And I assure you, if Wall Street didn't exist and if Wall Street didn't do that, our society would be completely and utterly different. And I think not nearly as enjoyable and pain-free in many ways that it is. I mean, in business school you learn about Maslow's needs hierarchy, and basically many of our basic needs are covered. I mean, we don't really think too much. Most people don't really think too much about where their next meal is going to come from, and whether they're going to get a paycheck. Can they get a refrigerator? Can they get cable service? Can they get an iPhone? I mean, I know that there's a lot of inequality that has resulted in our society, and that is an ongoing and continuing problem. But we are a land of incredible innovation.
You mentioned in the book too that part of this has been helped by things as simple as credit cards that we didn't used to have without the innovation.
I mean, think of a credit card is an unsecured line of credit to somebody who nobody really wants to take the time to figure out whether they have good credit or bad credit. I mean, if it's like a $10,000 unsecured line of credit in your pocket that you can use anytime you want. I mean, that is an incredible innovation, as is a home mortgage or a car loan. Right. I mean, all of those things are made available because of innovation that Wall Street.
The small businesses and people who are
everyday Americans.
Yeah, everyday Americans who are sort of susceptible to the idea that Wall Street is the demon in
Evil,
our
right.
economy are maybe unaware of the level of prosperity that Wall Street has been able to give us in terms of our standard
And
of
that's
living.
why I wrote this book.
On the other hand, there are the excesses of Wall Street are also well known. And as you said, playing with other people's money when Wall Street firms started to go public and stopped putting their own money at risk. But you have a very ingenious solution. Rather than Dodd-Frank's and all these very complicated solutions that have been foisted on us, you have a very ingenious solution. So why don't you tell us what the ingenious solution is? How do you hit them where it hurts?
Well, look, if you look at the history of Wall Street, as I have done as a writer and as someone who worked there for many, many years, Wall Street used to be a series of private, relatively undercapitalized partnerships where there was a Goldman, there was a Sachs, there were 3 Lehman Brothers, there were 3 Lazard brothers, there were Salomon brothers, there was a Smith and a Barney. There were people whose names were on the doors of these firms because they had created them, they had put their own capital in, and they had their own capital at risk every day.
Your money was on the line.
Their money, their reputation, their full net worth was on the line. Not just, before these became C corporations or limited liability corporations, they were literally private partnerships, and so their whole full net worth was on the line every day. And so I believe, and I think Wall Street has always been a dangerous place, but by and large, people were rewarded for taking prudent risks with their own money.
Right. And then in the 70s and 80s, when the companies went public, they started essentially they started using other people's money, OPM, other people's money to take risks, and they were rewarded for the risks whether or not the other people whose money they were using were rewarded themselves.
That's
correct. So that has led to a lot of the disasters of the past 20 or 30 years.
This began almost 50 years ago in 1970 with a firm named Donaldson, Lufkin, Gendrette, which went public. And my solution is basically to you're not going to make these firms private partnerships again. They're just too big. But you can take the top 500 or 1,000 people at these firms who make all the decisions about who gets promoted and who gets paid and what kind of business lines to be in and how capital is allocated, and force them to once again have their full net worth on the line or something like that. And that would make them
regulation. That sounds like something that can be done.
It can be done voluntarily too. Lloyd Blankfein, as he leaves Goldman Sachs, could voluntarily insist that Goldman Sachs change its compensation system to make these top 1,000 people at Goldman Sachs have their full net worth on the line again, or some facsimile thereof.
Do you see that happening?
Of course not.
No.
I don't even see it not happening non-voluntarily. No one listens to me about these things, but that would solve a lot of problems.
So then what you need is Elizabeth Warren's ear.
Well, I'm not even sure Elizabeth Warren's not the right messenger, because she's so. What you need is some, centrist person who's credibility and popular and can sway enough of votes to make it happen. Love him or hate him. It is something probably Donald Trump could do in this Congress. Right. But of course, he's not going to do. I don't think he can even understand what I'm even talking about. But there at some point, this, basically it should be done by the leaders of Wall Street. It shouldn't be something that has to be thrust upon them by regulators, because nobody likes that. Yeah. But if true leadership on Wall Street would be trying to do something like this.
Well, it would be nice to see true leadership on Wall Street. But, I'm thinking also about populism, because you talked about populism in the end of 19th century leading to the regulation of the robber barons and regulation of the initiation of the income tax in the early 20th century. And I read this article recently in Atlantic. You write for Atlantic now and again, by Anne Lowry about Jeff Bezos, 21st. And I'm thinking about 21st century populism and how it relates to 19th century populism and maybe tax reform, because you know a lot about the tax loopholes that exist on a corporate level, on tax loopholes that exist for hedge funds, carried interest, all this stuff that enables a lot of money to be accumulated without being currently taxed. And I'm wondering whether the combination of current populism and tax reform might lead, and the existence of people like Jeff Bezos, whose net worth is like skyrocketingly different than any ordinary millionaire's net worth, much less any ordinary person's net worth. Maybe all of that might lead to some more effective attempt to tax corporations and or tax individuals, whether flat tax or something like that. Have you given thought to tax reform and how we might try to deal with the perceived income inequality?
Well, we just had a tax reform bill pass the Congress
Did you
last
consider
year.
that effective in terms of helping corporate?
No,
No.
I mean,
so-
I mean, obviously, it's what corporations wanted by reducing the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21. You've created a bonanza of earnings, which has helped, I think, fuel the continuous rise of the stock market. But ironically, I think it was the anticipation of the tax law that fueled the rise of the stock market. And basically, since January, the stock market peaked out at 26.6, and now it's 25.4 or whatever. So, I mean, there has been a correction and a pullback. Unfortunately, I think that it's a case with this tax law of the rich continuing to get richer, and people who have money in the stock market. Corporate earnings are going to go up because J.P. Morgan Chase's earnings were basically $7.5 billion a quarter last year. First quarter of this year, given the new tax law, it was $8.7 billion. So you're making these wealthy corporations who have pre-tax income making their net income much higher, which theoretically should increase stock prices. If you own stock, therefore, you should benefit from that.
Is stock ownership wide enough in the country to keep the pitchforks
It's about
from waving?
50%, and a lot of people who don't think they own stock probably do
indirectly.
through their pensions and things like that. And I just don't know. I mean, we are a country. We're sort of schizophrenic on this topic. On the one hand, we want people to be able to innovate and get rewarded for their great ideas and to build new companies and to create iPhones and make Apple a $1 trillion company. And on the other hand, that leads to wide income inequality, which we seem like we don't like, and yet we don't want to be like Scandinavian countries. Right. So we're very schizophrenic on this topic, and I don't know what the answer is.
Is this generational? I mean, do you think that there are more people who want to be more like Scandinavia who are under age 25 or under age 30?
Well, I have 2 children under age
they don't
25.
want to be like Scandinavia?
Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. I mean, again, I think we're all very schizophrenic. It just doesn't seem right to us that Jeff Bezos can be worth $100 billion while there are people
150.
It's 150 now?
Yeah.
I can't even keep up. I mean, while there are people who are hungry, who don't know where their next
Yeah.
meal is going to come from, who are don't have proper housing even on this island.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is something that we struggle with, and now we're in sort of this period of time where kind of all bets are off. It's the Wild West under Donald Trump. We went from a period where probably the pendulum swung too far on regulation to now we're swinging it back the other way, where kind of anything goes, both ethically, morally, regulatorily, in the financial markets, in the tax system, and there will be a payback period. There will be a period of retribution as a result of the excesses that we're now experiencing. This isn't right. Maybe that was too far, but we haven't struck the right balance yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope we can find that before the pitchforks. So tell me, you've been thinking about Elon Musk and Tesla?
Well, I mean, I think that is a fascinating incident, shall we say? I mean,
using Twitter to
tweet out that you're
to move the market.
Well, Trump has been known to do that, but he's not
not for stock purposes.
Well, he's attacked individual companies through Twitter, and that has affected their stock price. But now we have Elon Musk, who's the CEO of his company and the biggest shareholder at something like 20%, announcing in Twitter that he's taking the thing private at $420 a share, and that it's a fully financed offer, which is, of course, not even remotely true, not even close to being true. And he's probably going to be paying the piper through the SEC.
Looks like it. Isn't that what was reported yesterday?
Yes, he's being investigated, and that's the right thing.
Right.
And we'll see if he's held accountable for that extraordinary lapse of judgment.
Well, Twitter seems to be a great instrument for people who have large egos and large followings, don't you think? I mean,
honestly, I've often thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do I write for Vanity Fair to write a Vanity Fair piece about Justin Bieber, not because of his singing career, but the fact that he has 100 million followers on Twitter. What's it like to have an army of 100 million people? I mean, if as a writer, if I had an army of 100 million people and I could just say, hey, could a few of you buy my book? I mean, that would make my books a bestseller. I mean, he seems to. It's extraordinary. These people who command huge armies, much more than even the great military leaders of world history have commanded armies of this size. It's extraordinary.
And it's funny that it's Twitter, because Twitter is not profitable yet. Twitter is not going anywhere or growing
Well, I think it's still like a $25 billion company. It's not nothing. It's flawed. It's deeply flawed. I'm not sure how the CEO can split his time between Twitter and his other business called Square. I mean, it's a work in progress. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it's a very powerful force, especially when news is breaking. And if you are among, the 250 people who command these armies, you can have a powerful impact. I mean, we all know what Trump uses it for every morning, and it's a shame, frankly, because he is using it as a diversionary tactic every morning to get the news media to just follow him and react to it.
And it works.
That's why he keeps doing it. I mean, it's everybody keeps doing what they're essentially rewarded to do.
Yeah, of course, and I think the news media should be the happiest group of people on the earth that this guy is president. It must be the best thing for their ratings.
And Les Moonves, the head of CEO, said as much.
Has he finally? I mean, they elected him, so now they elected him, and he's rewarding them, essentially.
Yes, there's clearly a symbiotic relationship there, and it's detrimental, and it's probably gone too far, and there are other things in the world happening of importance besides Donald Trump's morning tweets.
Right, but once in a while we become aware of it, not very often. But I hope that people do read Why Wall Street Matters. I think it's a useful
antidote. I hope they read all my books, but
I do too. They're interestingly written. The Last Tycoons, especially. But Why Wall Street Matters is just relevant right now. That everybody's so many people, especially on social media, seem to be on the trail with pitchforks and fury.
Well, and I think part of that is people like Elizabeth Warren, unfortunately, add to that. She'll be easily reelected in November, and she should become more of a statesman and try to be more balanced about what Wall Street does right and should be applauded, and what it does wrong that needs to be fixed.
And I think you're very even-handed about that. So that's what we need, something that's even-handed.
Well, that's why I wrote it, so that I thought maybe we could have a debate about this. Unfortunately, Donald Trump sucks the oxygen out of every room.
Yes.
If it's not about Donald Trump, nobody's really that interested, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think the book goes a long way towards helping that situation. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for this discussion. I appreciated it. It was really great.
Great. Thank you for having me.